My name is Tazana Croft. I'm 38 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been known as the steady one. I live in a quiet suburb outside the city, the kind of place where lawns are trimmed on Saturdays and neighbours wave without really knowing each other's stories. I've been a wife for 12 years, a mother, a financial administrator at a mid-sized architectural firm, the woman who remembers birthdays, the one who keeps receipts, the one who doesn't make scenes. If you met me at a dinner party, you probably wouldn't remember much about me afterward. I don't dominate conversations. I don't dress for attention. I listen more than I speak. People often mistake that for a lack of depth. My husband did. 3 months ago, he told me I was too boring for him. Not cruelly, not even angrily, just plainly, as if he were describing the weather. He said he wanted more excitement, more spontaneity, more life. After 12 years of marriage, he decided I wasn't it. And then he walked out. There was no dramatic fight, no screaming, no shattered plates or slammed doors, just a suitcase, a long sigh, and a sentence that sounded rehearsed. He said he deserved a more exciting life. At first, I thought the story would be about heartbreak, about betrayal, about learning to love myself again. But that's not really what this is. This is a story about being underestimated. It's about what happens when someone assumes quiet means passive, when they believe stability equals stagnation, when they confuse consistency with invisibility. And it's about something he discovered 3 months later, something about our finances he had never once bothered to notice. I won't promise you revenge. There was no dramatic showdown, no public humiliation, no screaming confession. What happened was quieter than that, and in some ways, far more final. This story isn't about destroying someone who hurt you. It's about understanding your own value when someone else fails to see it. It's about the slow, deliberate power of paying attention, even when no one thinks you are. I'll tell you exactly what happened. The small comments I ignored, the subtle shifts I rationalized, the moment something inside me stopped trying to be chosen, and the quiet decision that changed everything. If you've ever been called too much or not enough, if you've ever been dismissed because you weren't loud, if you've ever watched someone walk away thinking you'd simply stay the same without them, then maybe you'll understand why I didn't chase him. Tell me, have you ever been underestimated simply because you didn't make noise? For 12 years, I was the dependable one. That's the word people used when they described me. Dependable, not vibrant, not magnetic, not inspiring, just dependable. At work, I was the woman who never missed a deadline. If someone forgot to submit expense reports, I fixed it. If the quarterly projections didn't align, I recalibrated them. My boss once told me, if everyone had your temperament, this company would never have problems. It was meant as a compliment, but I noticed he didn't say it would be more exciting. At home, I was the organizer, the planner, the quiet architect behind our stability. I paid the bills, I optimized our mortgage terms, I refinanced when interest rates dipped, I tracked investments, I knew exactly how much we needed in emergency reserves and why. I could tell you the maturity date of every bond we owned without checking. My husband, Daniel, used to joke that he didn't need to understand the money because he had me. It sounded affectionate at the time. To our friends, I was the calm presence in the room. The one who listened, the one who remembered that Claire's mother had surgery last spring, the one who sent condolence flowers without being asked. But I wasn't the one who told wild stories. Daniel was. He was charming in that effortless way some men are. Loud enough to command attention, quick with humor, spontaneous. He liked last-minute road trips, new restaurants, big ideas. He would describe me to people as his grounding force. It took me years to realize grounding force was another way of saying background. When we first married, he used to say he admired my steadiness, that I made him feel secure. Over time, admiration shifted into assumption. Assumption slowly turned into expectation. Expectation hardened into entitlement. He expected dinner to be planned, holidays to be booked, insurance policies renewed, investments diversified. He expected the lights to turn on when he flipped a switch, without ever wondering how the wiring worked behind the walls. I don't say this with bitterness, just clarity. Somewhere along the way, my reliability stopped being seen as a strength and started being seen as the default. Like gravity, always there, unquestioned. At social gatherings, if I spoke about something analytical, tax strategy, housing markets, long-term equity performance, eyes would glaze over. If Daniel talked about a potential business venture or a new car he wanted, everyone leaned in. He once laughed and said, "Tazana loves spreadsheets more than people." Everyone chuckled. I did too, because correcting him would have made it awkward. And I didn't like it awkward. What no one noticed was that I wasn't quiet because I lacked opinions. I was quiet because I measured impact before speaking. I understood that words like investments compound over time, but people rarely respect what they don't understand. To them, I was stable, predictable, safe. And safe, apparently, is another word for boring. The strange part is this. I never felt bored with my life. I felt purposeful. There's a quiet satisfaction in building something sustainable, in knowing that crises can be absorbed because you prepared for them before they arrived. But preparation is invisible, and invisible things are easy to undervalue. When Daniel told me he needed more, I don't think he meant he wanted less of me. I think he simply forgot what I was holding up. And maybe that's what hurt the most. Not that he left, but he believed nothing would shift when he did. Looking back, I can trace the beginning of the unraveling to a single sentence. It didn't sound cruel. That's what made it dangerous. We were at a friend's birthday dinner, a long wooden table in a crowded restaurant, candlelight flickering against half-filled wine glasses. Daniel was telling one of his animated stories about a potential startup idea, something about eco-friendly modular housing. Everyone was leaning in, nodding, laughing at his exaggerated hand gestures. At one point, someone asked, "But how would you fund something like that?" There was a brief pause. Daniel smiled and lifted his glass slightly toward me. "Oh, I don't worry about that. Tazana handles the boring money stuff." Everyone laughed. He meant it lightly. I know he did, but something in the phrasing stayed with me. Not smart money stuff, not strategic, not responsible, just boring. I remember the exact sensation. Not anger, not humiliation. Just a subtle internal flinch. Like a paper cut. Small, almost invisible, but sharp enough to notice. I smiled. I even nodded. I said something self-deprecating about loving spreadsheets more than socializing, because that's what I did back then. I helped smooth over the narrative that minimized me. On the drive home, he was energized, talking about how supportive our friends were. I stared out the window at passing streetlights and asked casually, "Do you really think what I do is boring?" He shrugged. "Not boring, just, safe, predictable. You've always liked routine." Always! That word echoed, as if I had been fully formed the day he met me. As if curiosity, risk, imagination, those things had never lived in me. As if stability wasn't a choice I made deliberately. I didn't argue. Instead, I told myself he was just using lazy language. I told myself not to be sensitive. I reminded myself that marriage required resilience. But that night, when I opened my black leather planner to reconcile the week's expenses, I noticed something new. I didn't feel proud. I felt unseen. That was the first shift. It's strange how dismissiveness rarely arrives dramatically. It seeps in. A joke here, a tone there, a subtle comparison to someone more spontaneous, a passing comment about how I never surprise him. The next small cut came a few weeks later. He came home late from drinks with colleagues. He was buzzing with energy, describing a new hire. "She's fearless, always trying something new, not afraid to take risks." Then he looked at me and added almost absent-mindedly, "You'd probably think she's exhausting." I asked why. He shrugged again. "You're just different." Different. There it was again. Not said with admiration, said with distance. That night, I lay awake longer than usual. Not because I feared he was cheating, not because I felt threatened by another woman, but because I realized something uncomfortable. He had started defining me in contrast to excitement, and I had started accepting that framing. The truth is, I was never afraid of risk. I simply calculated it. I understood trade-offs. I believed in sustainable growth over reckless expansion, in finance, in relationships, in life. But none of that translates well at a loud dinner table. So the small cuts continued, and each time, I convinced myself they were harmless. That's how normalization begins, one quiet dismissal at a time. The most dangerous part of gradual disrespect isn't the comment itself. It's the way you start adjusting around it. After that dinner, I became more alert to Daniel's language. Not obsessively, just attentively. The patterns were subtle. When friends talked about spontaneous weekend trips, he'd say, Tazana likes structure. When someone mentioned a risky investment that paid off, he'd glance at me and grin. She'd never allow that. Allow, as if I were a cautious gatekeeper blocking his access to life. Wanted to try day trading for a few one-on-one kindred Wanted to try day trading for a few months. I quietly created a separate account to limit exposure. He wanted to refinance the house to free up capital. I negotiated the terms. I didn't restrict him. I protected us. But protection rarely feels thrilling. Over time, I started anticipating the jokes before they came. If someone mentioned risk, I'd lightly mock myself first. I'm the boring one who reads financial forecasts for fun. Laughter would follow, and Daniel would squeeze my hand as I'd just proven his point affectionately. It was easier to lean into the caricature than challenge it, because challenging it would mean asking a bigger question. Why does prudence make you uncomfortable? And I wasn't ready for that conversation. There was a particular evening that stands out now. We were invited to a rooftop gathering in the city. Music, fairy lights, 2 expensive cocktails. One of Daniel's friends asked me about what I'd been working on lately. I mentioned that I'd been studying long-term wealth preservation strategies, trusts, diversified portfolios, contingency structures. He blinked politely. Daniel laughed and said, See? Told you, she's 90 years old inside. Everyone chuckled. This time I didn't laugh. It was brief, just a pause, but Daniel noticed. Later in the car, he asked, Why were you so quiet tonight? I almost said, Because I'm tired of being the punchline. Instead, I said, I was just listening. He nodded, relieved by the simplicity of that answer. That's when I realized something uncomfortable about myself. I had begun rationing my voice, not because I lacked thoughts, but because I had learned which thoughts would be welcomed and which would be dismissed. And rather than repeatedly offer parts of myself that would be trivialized, I began offering less. I told myself it was maturity, that not every battle required engagement. Maintaining harmony was more important than correcting small slights. But small slights compound, just like investments. And what compounds quietly can become significant before anyone notices. The most insidious shift wasn't in how he spoke about me. It was how I began speaking about myself. I caught myself describing my job as nothing exciting. I started minimizing my role in conversations about financial strategy, even though I knew more than most people at those tables. I started shrinking preemptively. It's a peculiar thing to participate in your own diminishment because it keeps the room comfortable. I don't blame him entirely. He responded to the version of me I presented. And I had presented a version that absorbed impact without reaction. But something inside me was keeping score. Not in anger, in awareness. And awareness, once awakened, doesn't go back to sleep easily. The comments kept coming. Never cruel, never explosive. Just steady enough to reinforce a narrative. Safe, predictable, boring. And the more he said it, the more he seemed to believe it. What he never realized was that the quietest person in the room often sees the most. And I was starting to see everything. There's a moment in every long relationship when you realize you've been cast. Not chosen, cast. And once you see the role, you can't unsee it. For Daniel, I had become the stabilizer, the emotional ballast, the woman who would absorb stress, manage logistics, and keep the infrastructure of our life intact while he explored, experimented, and expanded. It wasn't malicious. It was convenient. He was the visionary. I was the system. At dinner parties, he'd describe future plans with animated enthusiasm. Maybe relocating abroad someday, maybe launching a consultancy, maybe investing in something bold and disruptive. People admired the ambition. They admired the scale of his ideas. When someone asked, "What does Tazana think about all that?" he'd answer before I could. "She keeps me grounded." It always sounded flattering, but grounding is invisible work. You only notice it when it's gone. At home, the division of labor looked balanced on the surface. He handled certain social obligations. He planned the occasional surprise weekend away. He was affectionate, attentive in bursts, and expressive. I handled continuity. I knew when the car insurance was renewed. I tracked mortgage amortization schedules. I monitored our pension contributions. I built spreadsheets modeling worst-case scenarios that no one hoped to face, but everyone would rely on if they arrived. The role I was assigned wasn't loud. It was foundational. But foundation work rarely earns applause. There was a particular Sunday afternoon that clarified everything for me. I was at the dining table, reviewing our quarterly financial summary, something I'd done every 3 months for over a decade. Daniel walked in, glanced at the paperwork, and sighed dramatically. "See? This is what I mean. You're always in numbers. Don't you ever get tired of living like this?" Living like this? I looked up at him and asked calmly, "Like what?" "Like everything has to be planned, calculated, safe." The word safe again. I wanted to ask him if he enjoyed knowing we could withstand job loss, if he appreciated that we'd paid off a significant portion of our mortgage early, if he valued that we'd built investment layers that most couples our age hadn't even considered. Instead, I said, "I like knowing we're secure." He shook his head slightly, not angrily, just dismissively. "You worry too much about the future. Sometimes you just have to live." That's when it settled in. In his narrative, I was the cautious one, limiting vibrancy. In mine, I was the architect of freedom. Because real freedom isn't impulsive. It's prepared, but our definitions are no longer aligned. Over time, I noticed he stopped asking my opinion on certain decisions. Not because he feared my disapproval, but because he assumed my answer. He'd say, "You probably won't like this idea, but," before I'd even spoken. And slowly, I stopped correcting him. It felt easier to let the role stand than to constantly reintroduce myself. Reliable, useful, invisible. I had become the quiet infrastructure of his life. An infrastructure, when functioning smoothly, is rarely admired. It's expected. What I didn't fully grasp then was this. When someone begins to see you only as a function, they stop being curious about you as a person. And when curiosity disappears, distance follows. The role I was assigned had stability, but it had no spotlight. And Daniel had started craving light. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no explosion, no accusation, no moment where I slammed a door or finally said everything I had been swallowing for years. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday. Daniel had come home later than usual. Not suspiciously late, just later than necessary. He was energized, almost restless. He paced the kitchen while I finished loading the dishwasher. "I've been thinking," he said. That sentence always carried weight. He leaned against the counter, arms folded. "I don't know if this is it for me anymore." I dried my hands slowly. "What do you mean?" "This." He gestured vaguely. The kitchen, the house, me. The routine, the predictability. I feel like I'm stuck in a life that's already written. There it was again. Predictable, stuck, written. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply asked, "Are you unhappy with me?" He hesitated. And that hesitation told me more than any dramatic confession could have. "It's not that you're bad," he said carefully. "You're just not exciting anymore." As if excitement had an expiration date. I felt something inside me go very still. Not shattered, not broken, still. For years, I had responded to his restlessness by becoming more accommodating. If he wanted spontaneity, I adjusted schedules. If he wanted change, I ran scenarios to make it feasible. If he wanted space, I gave it without complaint. But in that moment, I realized something fundamental. He didn't want an adjustment. He wanted contrast. And contrast requires someone to stand still while the other moves. I had been standing still for a long time. That night, after he went to bed, I stayed at the kitchen table with my planner open in front of me. I wasn't reviewing numbers. I was reviewing patterns. 12 years of them! I thought about the early days, when he admired my steadiness, when he said he felt lucky to have someone so thoughtful, so deliberate, when my caution felt like wisdom to him, not limitation. What had changed? Or perhaps the better question was, what had I allowed to change? The truth settled slowly. I had mistaken tolerance for strength. I believed that being calm meant absorbing impact indefinitely, that being mature meant not reacting, that loving someone meant cushioning their dissatisfaction so they wouldn't feel it too sharply. But calm is not the same as passive, and silence is not the same as surrender. For the first time, I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. If he walked away, what would actually collapse? I ran through the structure of our life in my mind. Mortgage terms, savings allocations, investment ownership, account access, documentation trails. And something unexpected happened. I didn't feel fear. I felt clarity. Because beneath all the narratives about excitement and boredom, there was a reality Daniel had never examined. I knew exactly how our life functioned. He did not. And that wasn't an accident. That night wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about plotting. It was about awareness shifting from emotional to structural. For years, I had been protecting a shared future. Now, for the first time, I considered protecting myself. The shift wasn't loud. It was internal. A quiet recalibration. If he wanted a different life, I would not beg him to stay in this one. But I would make sure I understood every consequence of that choice. And unlike him, I would not move impulsively. I would move deliberately. After that Tuesday, I stopped trying to adjust. Not visibly, not in ways anyone else would notice. But internally, something had shifted from reaction to observation. Daniel interpreted my quiet as indifference. I could see it in the way he watched me some evenings, almost waiting for a challenge that never came. When he hinted at needing more space, I nodded. When he talked about spending more time figuring himself out, I didn't argue. He mistook my composure for weakness. What he didn't understand was that silence feels very different when it's chosen. Before, my silence had been about preservation, keeping harmony, smoothing edges, preventing escalation. Now it was about information. I listened more carefully than ever. I noticed how often he framed dissatisfaction as destiny. Maybe we just grew apart. Maybe we want different things. Maybe this was inevitable. I never contradicted him. Instead, I asked neutral questions. What do you think you're missing? What would excitement look like to you? He spoke freely, relieved not to be challenged. He described spontaneity, unpredictability, and risk. He described feeling young again. He never described a partnership. That told me enough. At the same time, I began making small structural adjustments. Nothing dramatic, nothing illegal, nothing deceptive. Just clarifications. I reviewed our joint accounts more closely. I updated the documentation. I ensured every major asset was accurately categorized and properly recorded. I confirmed access credentials were secure and compliant. I organized digital and physical records so thoroughly that anyone stepping into my role would need months to understand the architecture. Not to hide anything, but to understand it fully myself. There's power in comprehension. And for the first time, I stopped assuming we were operating as a unit with equal awareness. One evening, he announced casually that he'd booked a weekend away. Alone. Just to clear my head, I nodded. That sounds like a good idea. He blinked, almost disappointed by the lack of friction. You're not upset? I want you to be sure about what you want, I said calmly. He left that Friday with a duffel bag and a restless energy that felt almost adolescent. I stayed home and finalized a long overdue portfolio rebalance. I reviewed our property equity. I mapped potential separation scenarios. Purely hypothetical, I told myself. Numbers don't panic. They don't accuse. They simply reflect reality. And reality was this. Our stability did not hinge on his emotional certainty. It hinged on structures I had built methodically for over a decade. When he returned Sunday night, he seemed lighter. I think I needed that, he said. I'm glad, I replied. But something else had changed. I no longer felt responsible for repairing his dissatisfaction. If he was restless, that was his internal terrain to navigate. My terrain was different now. Strategic, measured, prepared. Weeks later, when he finally said the words, that he thought he needed a break, that he wasn't sure this marriage fit who he was becoming, I didn't cry. I didn't plead. I simply asked, is this what you're choosing? He nodded. And I said, then let's make sure we do it correctly. He heard acceptance. What I meant was precision, because silence, when intentional, is not submission. It is control. The morning after Daniel moved out, the house felt quieter, but not emptier. There's a difference. Empty implies loss. Quiet implies space. He had left with 2 suitcases and a narrative. The narrative was simple. He needed something more exciting, something less predictable, something that didn't feel managed. I didn't argue with it. Instead, I made tea, opened my laptop, and began doing what I've always done best. I reviewed the structure. For 12 years, I had handled our finances with meticulous care. Daniel had full access to our accounts. I never restricted him. But access isn't the same as engagement. He saw balances. I saw patterns. He saw monthly payments. I saw long-term trajectories. He knew we were comfortable. He didn't know why. The first thing I did was print a complete asset map. Property equity, savings vehicles, retirement accounts, private investments, insurance policies, and contingency funds. Everything was documented, categorized, time-stamped. Nothing illegal, nothing hidden. Just clarity. I noticed something that made me pause. Over the years, I had diversified intelligently. Some investments were joint, some were structured differently based on tax efficiency and long-term planning strategies. I had followed professional guidance. I had optimized within the legal frameworks available to us. Daniel had signed documents when necessary, of course, but he had never asked questions beyond, "Is this good?" And I had always answered honestly, "Yes, it's good." What he never asked was how it worked. I began revisiting every decision I'd made over the last decade. Not to rewrite it, but to understand its implications if our marriage formally dissolved. I consulted our solicitor for a general information session. Calm, practical, no drama, just questions about the process. Asset division, timelines, documentation requirements. The solicitor asked, "Is your husband financially literate?" I considered the question carefully. "He trusts me," I said. She nodded in a way that told me she understood more than I'd said. In the weeks that followed, I didn't confront Daniel with spreadsheets. I didn't hint at consequences. I simply maintained composure while quietly ensuring every piece of our financial architecture was transparent, compliant, and ready for review. Meanwhile, he was posting photos, new restaurants, new friends, a new haircut, smiling in ways that suggested reinvention. Our mutual friends checked in on me gently. Some with pity, some with curiosity. Most assumed I was devastated. What they didn't notice was that I was studying. I revisited the mortgage contract. I recalculated equity distribution based on current market valuation. I analyzed liquidity scenarios. I examined pension contributions, his versus mine, over 12 years. I wasn't looking for an advantage. I was looking for accuracy. And accuracy can be uncomfortable when one person has been sleepwalking through responsibility. 3 months passed. He seemed buoyant, almost euphoric. The novelty of independence suited him. He mentioned considering a move to a smaller flat downtown. He talked vaguely about starting fresh. One afternoon, he asked if we could meet to sort out some practical things. I agreed. We sat across from each other at a quiet cafe. He looked relaxed, confident. He spoke casually about dividing things fairly. Selling the house, perhaps? Splitting proceeds evenly? Keeping things simple? Simple. That word again. I listened without interrupting. Then I opened my folder. Not dramatically, just gently. And I began walking him through the structure he had never taken the time to understand. No accusations. No anger. Just information. That was the moment I realized something profound. Excitement feels liberating when you believe the foundation will hold regardless. But foundations aren't magic. They are built. And I had built ours. He was about to learn what that actually meant. When I opened the folder in that cafe, Daniel smiled at first. I don't think he expected resistance. I don't think he expected complexity either. In his mind, dividing a marriage was probably like dividing furniture. Half the plates, half the books, sell the house, split the proceeds. Clean, simple, forward. I slid a single sheet of paper toward him. "Before we talk about selling anything," I said calmly, "we should make sure we're looking at the full picture." He glanced down casually. Then his expression shifted. Not dramatically, just a slight tightening around the eyes. "What is this?" he asked. "A summary," I replied. "Mortgage amortization, equity distribution, capital gains exposure, pension allocation differences, liquidity positions." He blinked. For 12 years, I had handled these details quietly. I had optimized when interest rates dipped. I had restructured debt when it made sense. I had diversified investments across vehicles with different legal implications. Every decision had been made transparently, but not loudly. Now I walked him through it. "The house isn't a simple 50-50 split," I explained. "We paid down principal unevenly over time because of income fluctuations. We also refinanced under terms that affected ownership percentages." He frowned slightly. "Ownership percentages?" "Yes," I said gently. We adjusted the structure 3 years ago for tax efficiency. You signed the paperwork. He looked confused. I trusted you, he said. You were right to, I answered. Everything was done properly, but proper doesn't mean simplistic. That's when it happened. The realization. Not that I had deceived him, because I hadn't, but that he had never truly engaged. He had floated above the mechanics of our life, assuming stability was automatic. I showed him the pension comparison next. Over 12 years, I have consistently contributed at maximum recommended levels. He had opted out temporarily more than once to free up short-term cash for ventures and hobbies. I had compensated quietly to maintain long-term balance. The difference was significant. He stared at the numbers longer this time. I didn't realize, he murmured. I know, I said. There was no triumph in that moment, no internal celebration, just clarity settling into the space between us. For years, he had framed me as cautious, as predictable, as someone who feared risk. What he hadn't seen was that I had been taking a different kind of risk, the responsibility of foresight, the burden of thinking 10 years ahead while he thought about next weekend. He leaned back in his chair. So what does this mean? It means, I said evenly, that if we move forward, we need to do it with full understanding, not assumptions. Silence stretched between us. For the first time since he left, he looked uncertain. Not about his feelings, about his footing. Excitement thrives on momentum, on forward motion, on the belief that you can leap and land safely. But in that cafe, Daniel realized something fundamental. The landing had always been engineered, by me, and now that we were separating, the engineering mattered. I didn't threaten, I didn't warn, I didn't suggest consequences. I simply closed the folder and said, "Take your time reviewing it. We can speak with a solicitor together if you'd like." He nodded slowly. The power in that moment wasn't aggression, it was information. And information, when delivered calmly, can be more destabilizing than anger. I left the cafe feeling lighter, not because I had won, but because everything was finally visible. After the cafe, Daniel grew quieter, not distant in the dramatic sense, not cold, just contemplative. The buoyancy that had defined his first 3 months of independence softened into something heavier, more thoughtful. He called twice that week with practical questions about timelines, about valuations, about what equitable distribution actually means in legal terms. For the first time in 12 years, he was reading documents fully. I answered calmly. Precisely. I never rushed him. I never weaponized knowledge, but I also didn't simplify it to make him comfortable. Because here's what I had realized. Clarity is respect. And I was done cushioning reality. One evening, he asked if we could talk in person again. This time at the house. I agreed. We sat at the same dining table where I had balanced quarterly summaries for over a decade. The same table where he once told me I worried too much about the future. He looked around differently now, as if seeing infrastructure instead of decor. I didn't understand how much you were managing, he said finally. I nodded but didn't fill the silence. He continued, if we sell, the numbers won't work the way I thought they would. I assumed I could reset, start fresh without too much complication. Complication, I almost smiled at the word. Starting fresh, I said gently, doesn't erase structure, it just changes who maintains it. He ran a hand through his hair. So what are you suggesting? That was the decision point, because I had options. I could negotiate aggressively, push for maximum leverage, force a rapid settlement while his footing was uncertain. I could also delay, create friction, let uncertainty pressure him into concessions. Or I could choose something irreversible but dignified. For weeks, I had run every scenario in my mind. Financial projections, lifestyle implications, long-term autonomy models. I already knew which option aligned with my moral code. I don't want to drag this out, I said calmly. If you're certain you want to leave, then we proceed properly. We get independent legal counsel. We divide according to structure. We don't pretend it's simpler than it is. He studied my face carefully. And you're okay with that? He asked. That question lingered. Was I okay with dismantling 12 years of shared life? No, but I was no longer willing to preserve something unbalanced simply to avoid discomfort. I'm okay with honesty, I replied. He looked down at this table. at the faint scratches from years of shared meals, shared mornings, shared assumptions. I thought you'd fight harder, he admitted quietly. There it was. He had expected resistance, tears, negotiation driven by emotion. Instead, he found deliberation. I did fight, I said softly. For years, just not loudly. Silence settled again. That night after he left, I stood in the kitchen and allowed myself one long breath. Not a sob, not a breakdown, just a steady exhale. The irreversible choice wasn't divorce. It was a withdrawal. I had withdrawn my emotional labor, my quiet cushioning, my habit of translating chaos into stability without acknowledgement. From this point forward, every consequence would be proportionate, transparent, documented. No anger, no revenge, just reality unfolding without interference. And once reality begins moving on its own, it rarely reverses course. Once the decision was mutual, or at least acknowledged, everything became procedural. That's the word people underestimate. Procedural sounds dull, administrative, impersonal. But procedure is where power quietly operates. I scheduled an appointment with my solicitor and informed Daniel he should secure independent counsel as well. Not as a threat, as a boundary. We both deserve representation, I said. He agreed, perhaps relieved that I was guiding the process without hostility. On paper, it looked straightforward. Long-term marriage, shared property, joint assets. But structure, as I had shown him, is rarely as simple as surface perception. While he adjusted to single life, new routines, new social circles, I adjusted to documentation. I gathered 12 years of financial records, mortgage statements, investment reports, pension contributions, insurance policies, tax filings, every refinance agreement, every reallocation. Not because I wanted to overwhelm him, but because transparency protects everyone. The solicitor reviewed everything carefully. You've maintained excellent records, she noted. That makes this significantly smoother. Smooth. That word felt almost ironic. Emotionally, nothing about dismantling a marriage is smooth. But administratively, it can be. If someone has done the unseen work for years, I made one additional choice that Daniel never saw coming. Not dramatic, not aggressive, just prudent. I separated my personal financial trajectory fully. New accounts were appropriate, adjusted contribution flows, updated beneficiary designations, reviewed long-term projections under a single income model. Again, nothing hidden, everything legal, everything deliberate. He didn't notice at first. Why would he? From his perspective, things were progressing calmly. We were handling it maturely. There were no shouting matches, no public accusations. Friends even commented on how civil we seemed. Civility can be mistaken for weakness. It can also be mistaken for forgiveness. But this wasn't about forgiveness yet. It was about alignment. One afternoon, Daniel called, sounding slightly unsettled. My solicitor says we need formal property valuations and a full asset disclosure. Yes, I said evenly. That's standard. He paused. It feels official. It is, I replied. That was the moment I realized something important. Until paperwork enters the room, separation feels hypothetical, emotional, fluid, something you can still narrate romantically. Once documents are signed, disclosures exchanged, and valuations requested, the story becomes structural. And structure doesn't bend to mood. I moved through each step quietly, signed where required, clarified where necessary, corrected minor inaccuracies in drafts, requested fair timelines. There was no satisfaction in it. But there was steadiness. 3 months earlier, he had walked out believing he was stepping into freedom. Now he was stepping into accountability. Not punishment, accountability. And I never had to raise my voice to enforce it, because the systems I built over 12 years were doing that work for me. Consequences don't arrive with sirens. They arrive with recalculations. At first, Daniel still sounded optimistic when we spoke. He talked about viewing new flats, about downsizing intentionally, about simplifying his life. But the numbers began to narrow his options. Property valuations came back higher than he expected. Good for total equity, but complicated when factoring in capital gains exposure and division structures. Selling wasn't as liquid as he'd imagined. Not after fees, not after taxes, not after proportional adjustments. Then there were pensions. His solicitor explained that long-term contribution discrepancies could be considered in settlement discussions. The temporary pauses he once viewed as harmless flexibility now had measurable weight. He called me one evening, voice tight but controlled. "I didn't realize how much of our future security came from your planning," he admitted. I listened. He continued, "I thought we were just comfortable. I didn't know it was engineered." Engineered? That word settled heavily between us. I didn't respond with triumph. I didn't say "I told you so." I simply said, "Security always is." Around the same time, subtle shifts appeared elsewhere. Friends who had celebrated his newfound spontaneity began asking quieter questions. "How's the settlement going? Is everything straightforward?" Excitement fades quickly when paperwork replaces adventure. He had assumed starting over meant stepping lightly into a new chapter. Instead, he was discovering that chapters close formally. Leases require deposits, insurance premiums shift, utility accounts carry histories, retirement contributions don't reset simply because your emotional state does. The practical cost of independence is rarely discussed in the glow of reinvention. One afternoon, he asked if we could reconsider selling the house immediately. "Maybe we should wait," he suggested. Market timing and all. It was the first time he had framed caution as wisdom. "I'm open to discussing timelines," I said calmly. "But decisions need to align with legal advice, not impulse." He exhaled slowly. "You're very composed about all this." "I've had time to think," I replied. That was true. I had been thinking for years. The most telling consequence, though, wasn't financial. It was psychological. The narrative he'd built, that he was escaping monotony, began colliding with the reality that stability had been a joint product of invisible labor. Without that labor automatically sustaining him, he felt the weight of maintenance for the first time. Bills had to be monitored. Accounts had to be balanced. Deadlines had to be remembered. He texted me once asking about a policy renewal date. I responded with the date. No commentary. Just information. I wasn't withdrawing kindness. I was withdrawing from management. And slowly, the absence of that management created friction in places he'd never anticipated. Not dramatic friction, just steady, like numbers that don't quite align when no one is recalibrating them behind the scenes. He wasn't panicking. Not yet. But the glow of excitement had dimmed. And in its place was something far less glamorous. Responsibility. The shift from uncertainty to regret is rarely loud. It begins with questions. Daniel's calls became more frequent, but less confident. Not frantic, not desperate, just searching. Did we always structure it that way? Was there a reason we allocated that percentage? Would it make sense to pause the process for a bit? Each question carried an undertone he didn't quite voice. Did I misunderstand what I was walking away from? One evening, he asked if we could sit down again, not to review numbers, but to talk. I agreed. He arrived looking different, not physically changed, just less certain of his footing. "I've been thinking," he began, echoing that Tuesday months ago. Maybe I was too quick. I didn't react. I let him continue. "I thought I needed something more exciting, but I didn't realize how much of what we had was rare." Rare. That word stayed with me. For years, I had been described as predictable. Now, predictability was being reframed as rarity. He leaned forward slightly. "What if we slowed down? Took more time? Didn't finalize anything yet?" There it was. The instinct to reverse momentum. But here's what he didn't understand. Momentum had shifted long before he noticed. For months, I had moved from preservation to preparation. From hoping to knowing. From reacting to choosing. "I don't think time will change the underlying issue," I said gently. "And what is that?" he asked. "You didn't leave because of paperwork," I replied. "You left because you believed you were missing something." He ran a hand across his face. "I thought you didn't care." That almost made me smile. "I cared very much," I said softly. "I just stopped competing with a fantasy." Silence settled between us. Not hostile, not heated, just as heavy with recognition. He wasn't panicking about money alone. He was panicking about a miscalculation. He had assumed stability would remain accessible, that he could step away, test freedom, and step back into structure if needed. But structures aren't revolving doors. They are commitments. And once someone withdraws from maintaining them, rebuilding requires more than regret. "I underestimated you," he admitted finally. "Yes," I said. "No bitterness, just truth." He looked around the house again. This time not as someone escaping it, but as someone realizing what it represented. 12 years of incremental disciplined decisions, quiet consistency, long-term vision. None of it is dramatic. All of it is powerful. I didn't think there'd be this much consequence, he said. There always is, I replied. It just isn't immediate. That's the difference between impulse and infrastructure. Impulse feels light. Infrastructure carries weight. By the time he understood the weight, we were too far into the process to pretend nothing had shifted. Not legally, but emotionally, because even if we halted every document tomorrow, something fundamental had changed. I no longer wanted to be chosen out of fear of loss, and he no longer fully understood how to exist without the systems I had quietly sustained. Regret had arrived. But timing matters, and this time, timing wasn't on his side. The final conversation happened on a grey afternoon. No storm, no dramatic soundtrack, just low clouds pressing softly against the windows. Daniel sat across from me at the dining table, the same table that had witnessed so many ordinary evenings. There were no folders this time, no spreadsheets, no printed summaries. Just us. I don't want this to end like a transaction, he said quietly. It isn't, I replied. It's ending like a decision. He absorbed that. For months, he had been reacting to structures, valuations, disclosures, legal language. But this moment wasn't procedural. It was personal. I thought you'd fight for me, he said after a while. The sentence wasn't accusatory. It was confused. I folded my hands gently on the table. I did fight. I fought by staying steady, by building something durable, by protecting what we had, even when you weren't paying attention. He looked down. I didn't see it, he admitted. I know. There was no edge in my voice. That was the part that unsettled him most. If I had shouted, he could have framed this as emotion. If I had blamed him, he could have defended himself. But calm leaves nowhere to hide. You make it sound like I was the reckless, he said carefully. You were optimistic, I answered. Optimism isn't wrong. It just needs good structure. He gave a small, humorless laugh. And are you with a structure? Yes. Silence again. Not uncomfortable, just real. He searched my face as if looking for the woman he once called predictable, as if hoping to find the familiar safety of being understood without effort. You don't seem he said. I'm not, I replied. That was the truth. Anger requires attachment to a different outcome. I had already accepted this one. What changed in you? He asked. I considered that carefully. I stopped trying to be exciting enough to keep you, I said, and started being honest enough to release you. He inhaled slowly, as if that landed somewhere deeper than numbers ever had. I thought you were passive, he confessed. I was patient, I corrected gently. There's a difference. Patience waits with awareness. Passivity waits without it. For 12 years, I had been aware of our finances, of our patterns, of the small dismissals that compounded over time, of the imbalance between emotional spontaneity and structural responsibility. And when he walked away, I didn't collapse because I had already built internal scaffolding. I don't know if I'll find something like what we had again, he said quietly. That's not something I can solve for you, I replied. No cruelty, just boundary. We finalized timelines that afternoon, agreed on next steps, confirmed solicitor meetings. When he stood to leave, he hesitated. I misjudged you, he said one last time. I nodded. Yes. There was no triumph in hearing it. Just completion. The confrontation ended not with raised voices, but with clarity. He had wanted excitement. I had offered stability. In the end, he learned stability isn't the absence of depth. It's the presence of discipline. And discipline, once withdrawn, doesn't reappear on demand. It has been a year since the paperwork was finalized. The house is still mine. Not because I fought for it emotionally, not because I refused to compromise, but because the structure supported that outcome, I chose to maintain it. The rooms feel different now. Not haunted, not heavy, just clearer. There's a kind of stillness that exists when you're no longer managing someone else's uncertainty. People sometimes ask if I regret not trying harder. I don't, because trying harder would have meant performing a version of myself that felt more dramatic, more reactive, more outwardly passionate. It would have meant chasing someone who had already framed me as insufficient. And I am no longer interested in auditioning for my own life. The most surprising shift wasn't financial independence. I already had that. It wasn't freedom from tension. That came gradually. It was identity. For years, I allowed myself to be summarized by a single adjective, predictable. Now I see what that really meant. Predictable meant consistent. Consistent meant disciplined. Disciplined meant powerful in ways that aren't immediately visible. I didn't become louder after the divorce. I didn't reinvent myself dramatically. I didn't book spontaneous flights just to prove something. Instead, I expanded quietly. I enrolled in an advanced certification program in strategic financial planning. Not because I needed the credential, but because I wanted the challenge. I began mentoring younger women at my firm who struggled with being overlooked in meetings. I started investing in ventures I personally believed in, rather than only those that made sense for us. For the first time, my foresight serves only me. And there's something profoundly peaceful about that. Daniel and I speak occasionally, cordially, briefly. There's no bitterness between us, just distance. He once told me he's learning to budget properly. I wished him well, not sarcastically, genuinely. Because this was never about punishing him. It was about stepping out of a role that required me to shrink in order to be appreciated. I've learned something important through all of this. Quiet does not mean small. Calm does not mean weak. And stability is not the opposite of excitement. It is what makes sustainable excitement possible. I don't feel like the woman who was left because she was too boring. I feel like the woman who finally stopped carrying more than her share. If someone enters my life again, it won't be because they mistake my steadiness for safety. It will be because they recognize it as a strength. And if they don't, I am perfectly capable of holding my own foundation. When Daniel walked out, he believed he was leaving something ordinary. 3 months later, he discovered he had been standing on something carefully constructed. Not glamorous, not loud, but intentional. There's a lesson in that. Not about marriage specifically, but about perception. We live in a culture that celebrates visible intensity, big emotions, bold risks, sudden reinventions. But the most powerful forces in a life are rarely theatrical. They are consistent, repeated, maintained without applause. For 12 years, I maintained. I wasn't perfect. I wasn't always expressive. I didn't always articulate when a joke cut deeper than intended. But I was present. I was invested. I was building. When he left, I didn't retaliate. I revealed. And sometimes revelation is more transformative than revenge. This story isn't about making someone regret losing you. It's about understanding your own weight in a structure long before someone else measures it. If you are the steady one, the planner, the organizer, the quiet thinker, please don't confuse invisibility with insignificance. Just because your work isn't celebrated doesn't mean it isn't foundational. And if someone labels you boring because you prioritize stability, ask yourself this: are you boring or are you disciplined? There's a difference. I don't hate Daniel. I don't wish him harm. He wanted a different life, and he chose it. What changed was that I stopped cushioning the impact of that choice. Sometimes quiet strength isn't about fighting harder. It's about stepping back and letting reality speak for you. So I'll leave you with this. Have you ever been underestimated because you were calm instead of chaotic? And when you finally stopped proving your worth, what happened next? I'd love to hear your story in the comments.
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ câu chuyện mới nhất. Hẹn gặp lại.